In a quiet suburban neighborhood, a seemingly innocent situation unfolds, one that will leave you questioning the unseen forces behind a child's actions. Picture this: a little girl, no older than 7, quietly trailing a police officer's wife every day after school. At first, it seems harmless, maybe just a child looking for attention, but what happens next will stun you. Every day, the little girl follows the officer's wife, and every day she remains silent, never asking for help or speaking up. The wife notices but doesn't think much of it at first, until she sees the girl again and again, always lurking in the background. The police officer's wife begins to feel uneasy. Why is the girl so persistent? Why won't she speak? And most importantly, what could be so important that the girl won't let go of this strange behavior? One day, the officer's wife finally confronts the girl. Her voice shakes with worry as she asks, "Why are you following me?" But the little girl's answer will leave her speechless. The officer's wife quickly realizes there's more to the story than she ever imagined. The little girl isn't just a curious child, she's carrying a secret, one that could be the key to solving an unexpected and dangerous mystery. Confused and anxious, the officer's wife tells her husband about the strange encounters, but even he struggles to understand. That is, until the pieces begin to fall into place. The officer suddenly finds himself caught in a web of events that's far too complicated for him to handle alone. He knows he has to do something before it's too late. But what exactly is the little girl trying to reveal? And why does she trust the wife of a police officer with such a heavy burden? The officer knows one thing for sure: this is no coincidence. Tension builds as the officer calls in backup, but nothing prepares him for what he's about to uncover. The girl's persistence, the odd behavior, and the cryptic answers all point to a larger, darker secret. As the officer and his team dig deeper into the mystery, they'll soon find themselves in the middle of a situation they never saw coming, one that will test their skills, their patience, and their resolve. But the big question remains: will they be able to crack the case before it's too late? Or will this innocent-looking child be the key to something far more dangerous than they could ever imagine? Stay tuned, because the truth is closer than anyone thinks, and it's about to explode in ways no one expected. The officer's name is Detective Mark Benson, a man who has seen his fair share of crime, danger, and tragedy. He's not easily shaken, but something about this situation gnaws at him. His wife, Sarah, had always been a kind and patient woman, especially with children. She'd never thought twice about the little girl following her around, assuming it was some odd quirk or need for attention. But now, after hearing her recount the strange events, Mark's instincts are on high alert. The little girl, whose name Sarah eventually learns is Emily, has lived in the same neighborhood for years, yet neither Sarah nor Mark had ever noticed her before. Emily's parents were a mystery too. Despite the fact that Mark has access to all sorts of information, there was no trace of them in any official records. No missing persons report, no criminal background, nothing that stood out. This made the situation even more unnerving. A child wandering around without anyone to care for her? That didn't sit right with Mark. He starts asking around. Neighbors describe Emily as a quiet, withdrawn child, someone who never interacted much with others. She didn't play with the other kids in the area and was rarely seen at school events. But what stood out the most was her demeanor, always distant, like she was carrying a heavy burden that none of them could see. Her clothes were always clean but plain, and there was an air of sadness that clung to her like a shadow. The more Mark learned, the more he felt that something sinister was lurking beneath the surface. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Mark asks Sarah to keep an eye on Emily, to see if she can learn more about what's happening. For days, Sarah tries to connect with the little girl, but Emily remains tight-lipped, her eyes carving around as though she's expecting someone or something to appear. Her fear is palpable, but she never offers an explanation. Sarah can feel the weight of Emily's silence, and it begins to eat away at her. Then one evening, as Sarah is walking home from the grocery store, she sees Emily standing by the street corner, staring down the road. Her posture is stiff, like she's waiting for someone. Sarah approaches her carefully, trying not to startle her. "Emily," she calls out softly. The little girl turns, and for the first time, Sarah sees real fear in her eyes. Emily's voice cracks as she says, "He's coming." Before Sarah can ask who, the little girl spins around and rushes down the street. Sarah follows at a distance, but soon Emily disappears into the shadows, vanishing like a ghost. She is nowhere to be found. This incident sends chills down Sarah's spine, and she calls Mark immediately. The tension in her voice is unmistakable as she explains what happened. Mark feels a cold knot form in his stomach. Emily's warning, "He's coming," replays in his mind over and over. Who is he? And why would a child so young and innocent be so terrified? Mark doesn't waste time. He begins reviewing old case files, hoping to find a connection. He combs through missing persons reports, local disturbances, and anything that might hint at a threat looming in the background. As he digs deeper, he uncovers a pattern of strange occurrences in the neighborhood. A series of unreported incidents, whispers of someone who's been watching, waiting. But there's no concrete evidence to connect the dots. Everything seems to vanish like smoke. Emily's behavior becomes even more erratic. She stops following Sarah, but now she's leaving cryptic notes, hidden in places only Sarah can find. The messages are nonsensical, but they carry an unmistakable urgency. Mark begins to wonder if this is a case of a child in distress, or if something far more complex is unfolding right in front of him. As the mystery tightens its grip on his family, Mark knows one thing for sure. They're no longer just dealing with a lost child. They're dealing with a hidden danger, one that's much closer to home than they could have ever imagined. The clock is ticking, and every new piece of information leads to more questions than answers. What will they uncover next, and what is the hidden secret that Emily is desperately trying to reveal before it's too late? The next few days will decide everything. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Emily's cryptic notes kept appearing in the most unexpected places, tucked into the folds of Sarah's coat, slipped into the mailbox, even inside the glove compartment of their car. Each one was more unsettling than the last. Some contained fragmented sentences like, "It's not safe anymore," or "The door is open," while others were simply drawings. A shadowy figure, a house surrounded by dark clouds, a pair of eyes staring through a window. Sarah, trying to make sense of it all, felt a growing fear for the little girl. She couldn't understand how Emily knew where she'd be or how she'd managed to place the notes without being seen. Meanwhile, Mark was following a new lead. He discovered that the house Emily was believed to live in had been sold several years ago to a man with a murky past. There were no photos of the man in any public records, and neighbors who had met him described him as reclusive, rarely seen outside. Mark's instincts told him this man might be connected to whatever was happening, but without solid evidence, he couldn't act. He decided to stake out the property, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever might be living there now. As he sat in his unmarked car late one night, Mark noticed something strange. A faint light flickered in the attic window, barely visible through the curtains. The rest of the house was dark and silent, but that small glow seemed to pulse like a beacon. Mark snapped a few photos with his phone and noted the time. It was almost midnight. He debated whether to approach, but decided against it for now. He needed to gather more information before making a move. Back at home, Sarah was growing increasingly anxious. She couldn't stop thinking about Emily's last words, "He's coming." Who was she talking about? What danger was lurking? Sarah tried to convince herself that the girl was just frightened, maybe imagining things, but deep down she knew better. Emily's fear was real, and whatever was scaring her had to be serious. The next day, Sarah decided to take matters into her own hands. She walked the neighborhood, asking if anyone had seen Emily recently. Most people said no, but one elderly woman hesitated. "I saw her 2 nights ago," she said softly. "She was standing in the park, just staring at the woods. When I asked her what she was doing, she didn't answer. She just kept looking like she was waiting for something." That revelation sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Why the woods? What could possibly be out there? She told Mark about the encounter, and they decided to investigate together. As they approached the edge of the park that evening, the atmosphere felt heavy, almost suffocating. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their bare branches twisting in the wind. Mark noticed something strange near the tree line, a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He bent down and picked it up carefully, unwrapping it to reveal a crude doll made of sticks and yarn. Tied around its neck was a piece of paper with one word scrawled on it: help. Sarah gasped, clutching his arm. They both knew this wasn't just a coincidence. Someone, or something, was leaving clues, drawing them deeper into the mystery. As they stood there, a faint rustling came from the woods. Mark's hand instinctively went to his sidearm, but Sarah gripped his arm tightly. "Don't," she whispered. "It could be her." They waited, holding their breath as the sound grew closer. Out of the shadows, a figure emerged, but it wasn't Emily. It was a man, his face partially obscured by the hood of his jacket. He stopped a few feet away, staring at them with an intensity that made Sarah's heart race. Before Mark could say a word, the man spoke. "You're looking for the girl," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "But you don't understand. You're not the only ones." Without another word, he turned and disappeared back into the woods, leaving Mark and Sarah frozen in place, the weight of his words pressing down on them like a storm about to break. Mark and Sarah stood motionless, staring into the dark woods where the man had vanished. His words echoed in their minds, "You're not the only ones." Who else was involved? And why had he appeared only to disappear without offering answers? Mark's instincts screamed at him to follow, but his training warned him against rushing into an unknown situation. Instead, he pulled Sarah closer and whispered, "We need to get back to the car." As they retreated, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made her flinch. Mark's hand rested lightly on his weapon, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The woods felt alive, as if holding its breath, waiting for the right moment to exhale. By the time they reached the car, Sarah's heart was pounding. She turned to Mark, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if he's right? What if we're too late?" Mark didn't answer. Instead, he drove them home in tense silence, his mind racing through the possibilities. Who was the man in the woods? Could he be connected to Emily? And if so, was he trying to warn them or lead them into a trap? As much as Mark wanted to believe they were getting closer to the truth, every new discovery only deepened the mystery. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the encounter in her mind, trying to piece together the fragments of the puzzle. Emily's fear, the notes, the warnings, it all pointed to something bigger, something just out of reach. Around 3 a.m., unable to stay in bed any longer, she wandered into the living room. That's when she saw it. A small envelope had been slid under the front door. Her breath caught as she picked it up, her hands trembling. Inside was another drawing, this time of a house engulfed in flames. Scrawled beneath it were 3 words: "Don't go back." Sarah immediately woke Mark, who examined the note with a grim expression. "It's her," he said quietly. "She's trying to protect us." But from what? Mark knew they couldn't ignore this any longer. Emily was in danger, and whatever was happening, it was escalating. He made a decision. "We're going to the house tomorrow. No more waiting." The next morning, Mark called in a favor from a trusted colleague, Officer Grant, to back him up. He didn't want to involve too many people, unsure of who he could trust. Together, they planned to approach the house cautiously, hoping to find answers without putting Emily or themselves in more danger. As they pulled up to the house, the air felt heavy, the kind of oppressive stillness that comes before a storm. The curtains were drawn, and the flickering attic light was visible again, even in broad daylight. Mark's gut twisted as he approached the door. Before he could knock, the faint sound of a child's cry reached his ears, barely audible but unmistakable. Mark signaled for Grant to cover him and turned the doorknob. To his surprise, it wasn't locked. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway. The air inside was stale, carrying a faint metallic scent that set Mark's nerves on edge. He called out softly, "Emily? Are you here?" His voice echoed back, unanswered. The cry came again, louder this time, from somewhere upstairs. Mark motioned for Grant to follow, and they began climbing the stairs, each step creaking under their weight. Sarah stayed outside, her heart pounding as she gripped her phone, ready to call for more help if things went wrong. As Mark and Grant reached the top of the stairs, the sound of the crying stopped abruptly. They exchanged a glance, both gripping their weapons tightly. The hallway was lined with doors, all closed except for one at the end, where the flickering light spilled out onto the floor. Mark led the way, his pulse racing as he pushed the door open. Inside, the room was empty, save for a single chair in the center and a small figure huddled beside it. Emily. She looked up, her tear-streaked face pale and her eyes wide with terror. "He's here," she whispered, her voice trembling. Before Mark could respond, a loud crash came from downstairs, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Mark's heart raced as he turned to Grant. "Stay with her," he said, his voice firm. Then, gripping his weapon tightly, he moved back toward the stairs, bracing himself for whatever or whoever was waiting below. Mark's footsteps were slow and deliberate as he descended the stairs, his ears straining to catch every sound. The heavy footsteps had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that made his skin crawl. His grip tightened on his weapon as he scanned the darkened entryway. The front door was still ajar, letting in faint daylight, but nothing else seemed out of place. And yet, he could feel it, that suffocating sense of being watched. Behind him, Grant's voice came through the radio in a low whisper. "Mark, she's saying something, but it's not making sense. She keeps repeating, 'It's not him.'" What does she mean by that? The words sent a chill through Mark. Not him? Then who? Before he could respond, the faint creak of a floorboard came from the kitchen. Mark's pulse quickened as he moved toward the sound, his every nerve on edge. As he rounded the corner, he froze. Standing there, partially hidden in the shadows, was the same hooded man they'd seen in the woods. His face was still obscured, but his posture was calm, almost casual, as if he had been expecting Mark. "You shouldn't have come here," the man said, his voice low and firm. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." Mark didn't lower his weapon. "Step into the light," he demanded. "Now." The man hesitated, but eventually stepped forward, revealing a face that was gaunt and weathered, his eyes hollow yet piercing. He raised his hands slightly, a gesture of surrender, but his expression was anything but submissive. "You're putting her in danger," he said. "All of you." "Who?" Mark pressed. "Emily? Danger from who? From you?" The man shook his head, frustration flickering across his face. "No, from the ones watching. They're always watching." His voice dropped to a whisper. "They want her back." Mark's grip faltered slightly. "Who are they, and why her?" The man's gaze darted to the stairs, his expression shifting to one of urgency. "You have to leave. Now. If they know you're here, they'll come for all of you. You have no idea what they're capable of." Before Mark could ask another question, a deafening crash erupted from upstairs, followed by a scream. Grant's voice, sharp and panicked. Mark's heart leapt as he spun around and bolted up the stairs, taking them two at a time. The hallway was in chaos. The door to the room where Emily and Grant had been was wide open, and inside the scene made Mark's stomach drop. The chair in the center of the room had been overturned, and Grant was on the floor, clutching his arm, blood seeping through his fingers. Emily was gone. She ran," Grant stammered, his face pale. "Something spooked her. She kept saying, 'They're here,' and then she bolted out the window. I couldn't stop her." Mark's mind raced. "Where did she go?" "She was heading for the woods," Grant said, wincing in pain. Mark's blood ran cold. The woods. The same place Emily had been drawn to before. The same place the hooded man had first appeared. He didn't have time to think. He had to act. But as he turned toward the stairs, he froze. Standing at the bottom, looking up at him, was the hooded man. "She's leading them to the source," the man said, his tone grim. "And if you don't stop her, none of us are walking out of this alive." Mark didn't hesitate. Ignoring the hooded man's cryptic warning, he raced back down the stairs and out the door, his eyes scanning the edge of the woods. The trees loomed dark and forbidding, but he caught sight of movement, a small figure slipping between the trunks. It was Emily. She was running, her little legs carrying her deeper into the forest as if being drawn by some invisible force. Behind him, the hooded man called out, "If you follow her, you'll only make it worse. She has to face it alone." Mark didn't slow down. He couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Emily was a scared child, and whatever she was running toward, she didn't need to face it alone. The woods were dense, the branches clawing at Mark's jacket as he pushed through. He could barely make out Emily ahead, her small frame weaving through the trees. "Emily!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Stop! Come back!" She didn't look back. If anything, she seemed to be running faster. The air grew colder the deeper Mark went, an unnatural chill that made his breath come out in clouds. The forest grew darker. even though it was still daylight. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant sound of Emily's hurried steps. Mark's gut told him something was wrong, terribly wrong, but he couldn't turn back now. Finally, he broke through into a small clearing. Emily was there, standing perfectly still in the center, her back to him. She was staring at something, but Mark couldn't see what. Slowly, cautiously, he approached. "Emily," he said softly, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's okay. I'm here. You're safe now." Emily turned to look at him, and the sight made his blood run cold. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and glassy, as if she were in some kind of trance. She raised a trembling hand and pointed behind him. "They're here," she whispered. Mark spun around, and his heart hammering in his chest. The clearing was empty. At first, he saw nothing but trees and shadows, but then the shadows began to shift, to move. Figures emerged, silent and shrouded, their shapes barely human. They didn't speak, but their presence was overwhelming, oppressive, as if the air itself had turned against him. The hooded man's voice echoed in Mark's mind. "She's leading them to the source." Mark realized too late what that meant. Emily hadn't been running away, she'd been leading these things here. But why? And what did they want? Emily's voice broke through the suffocating tension. "I had to," she said, her tone filled with quiet resignation. "They promised they'd leave if I brought them here. They only want him." Mark's chest tightened. Who? Who do they want?" Emily pointed at Mark. "You." The shadows surged forward, their movements like a tide, swift and unstoppable. Mark braced himself, his mind racing for a way out. But just as the darkness closed in, Emily stepped in front of him, her small frame glowing with a faint light. The figures stopped, their shapes writhing as if caught in some invisible force. "I made a deal," Emily said, her voice steady now. "You can't have him. Take me instead." Before Mark could react, the light around Emily flared, blinding and brilliant. The shadows recoiled, twisting and shrinking until they disappeared entirely. The clearing was silent again, and when the light faded, Emily was gone. Mark dropped to his knees, the weight of what had just happened crushing him. The hooded man stepped into the clearing, his expression grim. "She saved you," he said quietly, "but she'll never come back." Mark's voice broke. Who were they? What did they want? The man didn't answer. He simply turned and walked away, leaving Mark alone in the empty clearing, haunted by the echoes of a child's sacrifice. Mark remained on his knees in the empty clearing, his mind swirling with disbelief and grief. Emily's final act replayed in his head. The glow, her steady voice, and the way she stood between him and the shadows. She was gone, but the weight of her sacrifice pressed down on him like a heavy stone. Why had she done it? And what had she been protecting him from? The hooded man's words echoed in his mind. "She saved you, but she'll never come back." Mark clenched his fists, anger and sorrow welling up inside him. He had come here to save her, to pull her out of whatever nightmare she had been living, but instead, she had saved him. The guilt was suffocating. He forced himself to stand, his legs trembling beneath him. The forest seemed quieter now, as if the strange force that had gripped it had vanished with the shadows. Mark's gaze swept the clearing one last time, hoping for some sign of Emily, but there was nothing. The space felt hollow, like a place that had been abandoned for centuries. When he returned to the edge of the woods, Sarah and Grant were waiting for him. Sarah's face was pale, her eyes wide with worry. "Where is she?" she asked, rushing toward him. Mark shook his head, unable to find the words. The look in his eyes told her everything. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "No," she whispered. "She was just a little girl." Mark looked at Grant, who was sitting on the ground, his arm hastily bandaged. "We need to go," Mark said quietly. "It's over." But even as he said the words, he knew it wasn't. Not really. There were still so many unanswered questions, so many pieces of the puzzle that didn't fit. Who were the shadowy figures? What had Emily been protecting him from? And why him? In the days that followed, Mark and Sarah tried to piece their lives back together, but the weight of what had happened lingered. The hooded man had disappeared, leaving no trace behind, and the house where Emily had lived was empty when officers returned to investigate. It was as if the entire place had been wiped clean, leaving nothing but memories and questions. Mark spent hours replaying every moment in his mind, searching for clues. One night, he found himself looking through Emily's drawings again. Among them was one he hadn't noticed before, an image of a bright light surrounded by shadows with a figure standing in the center. It was Emily, her small frame glowing, just as he had seen in the clearing. Below it were the words, "I will protect him." Tears filled Mark's eyes as he realized she had known all along. Somehow, Emily had understood what was coming and had chosen to face it for him. Her bravery, her sacrifice, it was something he would carry with him forever. As he stared at the drawing, Mark whispered, "Thank you, Emily." He didn't know where she was now, but he hoped she had found peace. And though the pain of losing her would never fade completely, he knew he had to honor her sacrifice by living a life worthy of it. The shadows had taken her, but they had left him with something powerful, the reminder that even in the darkest moments, light could prevail.